The North, no longer choked by the landmarks of traditional heavy industry that once defined the South's view of it. The real picture was never thus, of course, beyond the conurbations. Either way, it's all different now. Few and further between are the mills, factories, pits and foundries that drew railway companies to compete in this lucrative marketplace through the 19th century. Many of the tracks they laid have also been erased. But to overcome the challenges posed by the North's terrain, engineers had been forced to build upwards. Still surviving are some truly magnificent viaducts. Thomas Bouch was a prolific boundary-pushing engineer until his career was blighted by the Tay Bridge disaster. In the late 1850s, he laid out an ambitious line across the Pennines to connect the ironstone mines around Barrow with blast furnaces near Bishop Auckland. But instead of tunnelling, the route climbed formidable gradients to reach Stainmore Summit, 1,370 feet above sea level. Doing so involved the construction of 12 substantial viaducts. Whilst not the biggest, Smaardale Gill was arguably the most attractive, set in remote countryside between T-Bay and Kirby Stephen. Built of sandstone from the quarries of Mr. Wakefield a few hundred yards away, its 14 arches carry the railway 92 feet over Scandal Beck, its eastern end curving gently northwards as it did so to connect with a ledge cut into the side of the deep valley. Responsible for erecting it, under the superintendence of resident engineer James Affleck, was Preston-based contractor Henry Rigg, the price tag £11,298, about 1.2 million in today's money. The two men ceremonially laid the last stone on the 2nd of April 1861, the local paper reporting that the work had been brought to a conclusion without serious accident. Quite an achievement given the challenges involved. 3 months later, the first mineral train tested their work. In the line's early days, the haul of coke heading west over the viaduct exceeded 1 million tonnes annually. But all things being relative, this success was short-lived. Despite its celebrated engineering, the Stainmore line survived for little over a century, closing in January 1962. Smaardale Gill became a cause for concern in 1985 when masonry started falling from one of the piers. It could have been demolished were it not for the formation of the Northern Viaducts Trust, which acquired the structure and then restored it at a cost approaching £400,000. The work was completed in 1992, and this fabulous structure has since hosted a permissive path. The Trust still look after it, ensuring Smaardale Gill will grace this corner of Cumbria long into the future. It's fair to say Torksey Viaduct is not magnificent in the conventional sense. The landscape is pleasant but hardly majestic, the structure appears rather austere. But there are other ways to measure magnificence. Whilst Robert Stevenson was engineering his famous tubular girder bridge across the River Conwy in North Wales, John Fowler pushed the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway over the Trent between Retford and Lincoln. Both structures were built in wrought iron to designs by William Fairbairn, and they share the same basic principles. Trains, though, passed through Stevenson's girders, but between Fowler's. In reality, then, Torksey was actually an early box girder bridge 100 years before they became commonplace. Innovation often meets resistance, and it certainly did here. Captain Lintorn Simmons, the Board of Trade's inspector, refused to permit the viaduct's opening, insisting that it will be attended with danger to the public. He had, though, got his calculations wrong, failing to recognise the advantages of continuous girders over the two main spans. The engineering fraternity rallied around Fowler, and after 4 months of testing and technical argument, Torksey Viaduct carried its first commercial train in April 1850. Fairbairn condemned the pernicious effects of government interference and the want of practical skill. The structure did evolve over the years as traffic loadings increased. The timber approach viaduct was rebuilt in cast iron, and a conventional lattice girder was inserted in 1897 to stiffen the main spans. Read into that what you will. Whilst its new role as host to a footpath will not test its mettle to any great extent, it will restore function to a structure that helped to sharpen the cutting edge. In the early 1880s, the hills to the south of Keighley were alive with industry as the Great Northern Railway drove an extension of its Thornton branch northwards to serve the town. This established a link between Yorkshire's key textile centres, useful for the movement of goods, as well as opening a new corridor to the north, avoiding the congestion around Leeds and Bradford. The route presented huge engineering challenges, but contracted to build it were Benton and Woodywis, who'd faced even greater ones on the summit section of the Settle and Carlisle. South of Cullingworth, the intended alignment followed the west side of a valley, but Bradford Corporation opposed this due to the risk of tapping a spring which fed one of the city's reservoirs. The diversion had to cross the valley, demanding the construction of Hughenden Viaduct, something the Great Northern no doubt cursed. Problems emerged at every turn. The foundations had to be sunk through clay and shale, reaching a depth of 62 feet, half the height of the viaduct. 2 engines worked around the clock, pumping water from the workings. The scaffolding alone cost the equivalent of £400,000. And on the 20th of January 1882, a travelling crane fell 6 feet off the end of a gantry, carrying 3 navvies with it. 34-year-old labourer William Stotton sustained nothing more than a bruise to the head, but died as he was carried home. Opened on the 1st of April 1884, the viaduct extends for 376 yards, comprising 17 arches, each 50 feet in span, and curving to the west on a radius of 30 chains. It reaches a height of 123 feet. But they're just raw statistics. More than that, Hughenden is an exceptional structure, one of England's finest, certainly one of its highest. And despite closure claiming it in November 1963, the viaduct's reuse by Sustrans as part of the National Cycle Network ensures it will stay in the public eye, still playing the transport role engineer Henry Fraser built it to fulfil. The Great Northern Railway put its trust in Benton and Woodywis on more than one occasion. They were amongst the GN's chosen contractors when it came to progressing its Derbyshire and Staffordshire extension, with an eye on securing a slice of the region's mineral traffic. There was, however, a problem. A lengthy viaduct had to be built to cross the Erewash Valley, but the ground beneath it was riddled with old coal and ironstone workings, the records for which had disappeared. With the honeycombed formations unable to take a great weight of masonry, the Great Northern's resident engineer, Samuel Abbott, designed a structure in wrought iron. Not only was this light, it could also withstand considerable distortion in the event of subsidence. It proved a wise choice. Not only did two nearby bridges give way during construction, the viaduct's western abutment had to be repaired following movement of the approach embankment. Ilkeston Viaduct, generally known now as Bennerley Viaduct, was built in just 18 months, work finishing in November 1877. Almost 500 yards in length, it boasts 16 lattice girder spans, reaching 61 feet above ground level, with 3 further spans at the western end over the Erewash Valley line. The main structure is supported by piers, each consisting of 12 wrought iron columns, riveted together in 4 sections and then cross-braced. Instead of fixing the rails to way beams, the tracks were ballasted, laid on a corrugated plate deck, which allowed them to move in the event of settlement. All this ironwork imposes a load of just 1,200 weight per square foot on the structure's foundations, which are formed of Staffordshire blue brindle bricks on a bed of concrete. The viaduct was built to last, which is just as well. In January 1916, it narrowly survived a bombing raid by a German Zeppelin airship, and when the Derbyshire Extension's goods traffic encountered its last red signal in 1968, the costs of dismantling the wrought iron components, rivet by rivet, proved so eye-watering the idea was eventually abandoned. Any remaining doubt was dispelled in 1974 with the bestowing of a Grade 2-star listing. After 40-odd years in decline, prospects are now looking brighter for Bennerley Viaduct. It joined 600-plus other disused railway structures on the inventory of Railway Paths, sister charity of Sustrans, in 1998. As a result, plans to place it at the heart of a local cycle path network are edging ever closer to fruition. Conflict between competing companies was commonplace through the 19th century. Witness the line between Ingleton and Low Gill, connecting North Yorkshire to Cumbria. This could have been the main line between West Yorkshire and Scotland, were it not for the fractious relationship between the London and North Western Railway, who controlled it, and its expansionist rival, the Midland. The latter walked away and built the Settle and Carlisle line at humongous cost. The Ingleton branch settled down to a life of little importance, an unfortunate fate for a railway blessed with both fabulous vistas and fabulous engineering. Amongst the highlights, Lune and Low Gill viaducts. On the 4th of January 1859, dignitaries gathered at Low Gill to witness the viaduct's foundation stone being laid by W.A.F. Saunders, chairman of the Lancaster and Carlisle Railway. Samuel Buxton, the contractor, presented him with a mallet and silver trowel for his efforts. Saunders gave the navvies wholesome advice on their conduct before the party headed off to Sedbergh for dinner at the Black Bull. The workforce, meanwhile, crossed the road to the beer shop. James Smith, Elijah Halty and John Roberts were a little the worse for wear as they walked up what is now the West Coast Main Line back to the cottage they shared near T-Bay. Smith and Halty never got there. At 6:15, a northbound express emerged from the darkness to strike Smith, who was walking between the two tracks, severing his head and both legs below the knee. Halty's intestines were protruding from a wound on his side. He passed away in hospital later that same evening. The driver knew nothing of the accident until the following morning when he found hair on the axle box of his locomotive. Things weren't much better 2 miles south at Furbank, where Lune Viaduct was emerging from the ground. In July 1859, labourer William Tailforth was working on a scaffold when he was struck by the handle of a winch he was using to hoist up blocks of stone, plunging 50 feet to his immediate death. And 6 months later, another navvy, William Foreman, fell 30-odd feet from a larch tree as he pursued a squirrel up it. He survived for 2 days before his injuries got the better of him. In the great scheme of things, these events were momentary distractions. The great and the good turned out to see Donald Campbell, the resident engineer, key Loon's last arch in February 1860. He did the same thing at Low Gill 5 months later. The world had kept on turning. But it's easy to forget that the lifeless lumps of iron and masonry still decorating our landscape all have a human story to tell, a story of great adventure and sometimes of tragic misadventure. In a region littered with engineering feats, the unpretentious line along the Dearne Valley would have been easy to overlook were it not for one immense structure. Like many others, the railway was unabashed in its intentions to reap the financial rewards offered by the developing South Yorkshire coalfield. As such, it didn't trouble mapmakers until early in the 20th century, encouraged by the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, which was keen to establish a presence beyond its existing boundaries. The valley of the River Don presented engineer Stanley Kay with some difficulties, first passing over a tunnel on the Sheffield-Doncaster line, then having to cross the river at such a height as to preclude the need for a swing span. The result was Conisbrough Viaduct. The design of the structure, specifically the choice of brick or steel, was subject to careful calculation to effectively and economically address the implications of nearby mine workings. A pillar of coal had to be acquired from a local colliery to ensure the viaduct wouldn't be undermined. Ground conditions proved problematic. Instead of laying temporary railways to serve the whole site, as convention dictated, the contractor, Henry Lovett, instead arranged for Henderson's of Aberdeen to install an aerial ropeway between two 80-foot towers erected either side of the valley. This system provided a carrying capacity of 3 tons over a distance of 625 yards. The viaduct has monopolised views of Conisbrough since it was brought into use on the 17th of March 1909. It has enormous presence. 509 yards long, featuring 14 spans on the north side of the river and 7 more to the south. Joining them together are 2 150-foot lattice girders and a steel plate deck, collectively weighing 310 tons and reaching a height of 116 feet above the Don. The huge abutments either side of this span moved inwards by almost 9 inches due to heat expansion during their first 25 summers, before equilibrium was reached. The 11th of July 1966 brought the viaduct's operational demise, but its transfer to Railway Paths in 2001 opened the door for it to be reborn into public service 9 years later as host to another of Sustrans' cycle paths. Conisbrough Viaduct survived in part thanks to the overwhelming costs of demolishing it. Many others were not so lucky. Great iron structures at Beela, Crumlin, Staithes and elsewhere were salvaged for their scrap value. Some were sacrificed at the altar of health and safety. But other losses were inexplicable, a function of the treacherous wrecking ball culture that accompanied the railway's reshaping in the 1960s. We must, though, be thankful for what we've been left with. Disused viaducts should not be written off as unwelcome legacies of our industrial past. They enrich landscapes, they honour our history as engineering pioneers, they still have roles to play if we allow them to. Heavy industry might have withered, but the valleys of northern England still owe much of their unique character to the landmark viaducts that span them.